Take a seat.
Thank you all very much. I appreciate the comments on the books, and I will just point out that the latest has just appeared. I got a copy yesterday, so for those who might be interested, I'll pass it around. You can dial up your Amazon account immediately and pursue it at great length at the risk of competing with my own talk. And I wouldn't be conforming to cultural stereotypes if I didn't begin with something that passes for humor or a joke. The story is told of Albert Einstein dying, going up to heaven, and saying that he deserves to go in, and St. Peter looking at him and saying, well, you look like Einstein. I can see the hair and everything else, but you have to prove that you really are Albert Einstein. Lots of people are trying to do anything to get in here. Einstein says, well, how about a chalk and blackboard? St. Peter snaps his finger. Instantly they appear. Einstein begins with the equations and begins to explain the theory of relativity. St. Peter is very impressed and says, well, Mr. Einstein, certainly welcome to heaven. And he turns around and suddenly there's Pablo Picasso. And he said, well, you look like Picasso, but, can you really prove who you are? Picasso looks at the equations that Einstein has left, takes the chalk, re-scribbles on them, and suddenly you've got Guernica there. And St. Peter says, geez, I'm really impressed. You certainly are Picasso. Please come in. And he turns around again, and here's George W. Bush. And he says, well, you're going to have to prove who you are. I just let in Einstein and Picasso, but only after they proved who they were. And Bush says, well, who are Einstein and Picasso? And St. Peter says, well, come on in. Now, Bush does allow the late-night comics a great deal of opportunity, but the subject that I'm going to deal with tonight is, I hope, a little bit more serious. And essentially what I want to do is take a look at what I consider some of the major failings of the Bush administration with regard to Asia. I've titled the talk, as you can see, How Bush Bungled Asia. But essentially, I want to focus on a number of things. But in order to do that, let me start by trying to make the case for Bush as I read it, and I'm trying to be as honest as I can with a number of the supporters of the Bush administration. One of the points that an awful lot of supporters make is that generally American relations with Asia are good. Condi Rice has talked about the fact that the U.S. is in a stronger position in Asia than at any other time. Victor Cha, who was in the administration dealing with the six-party talks, has made many of the same claims. U.S. position in Asia is now stronger than ever, and Asia remains at peace. Essentially, I think the claims, or one stream of these claims, suggests that relations with the Middle East may be problematic. The U.S. may have lost some credibility with what is often called Old Europe. Latin America has seen the rise of a number of anti-American populist leaders, partly linked to the Bush administration. But essentially, Asia is not as bad as these other places, and that in many respects, there may be much better relations. Mike Green, who is a National Security Counsel, takes it even further in some respects, arguing that in many ways, Iraq has been the key to American success in East Asia, arguing that U.S. alliances are stronger, particularly the alliance with Japan, but also, he argues, elsewhere, the alliance with Korea. The essential point here is that many countries in Asia, seeing America's willingness to go to war in Iraq and its willingness to use its military muscle, have been positively impressed and, for one reason or another, have re-strengthened their ties with the United States or moved more closely to the United States as a consequence. And perhaps still a third point that could be made would be to say that that America's overall image and overall collective strength has led not to galvanizing of opinion against America, but rather to an acceptance of the U.S. war on terrorism and an effort to align more closely with the U.S. And in addition to Japan, South Korea, Indonesia, Singapore are often cited as cases of this. The United States has moved to a closer relationship with India that involves acceptance of India's nuclear pact or nuclear efforts. There is military cooperation in a host of areas, and many would also point to the fact that the U.S. military's assistance in the 2004 tsunami has led to a wave of popular support for the United States. So there is a certain case to be made that on certain areas or certain levels, U.S. relations may not be all that bad. I think in many respects, when they talk about this, they set a very low standard or a very low bar. The fact that there is no conflict, no military conflict in Asia these days really reflects the fact that Asia has been at peace for about 30 years since the conflict with Vietnam, Cambodia, China in Southeast Asia. And this is not in any way due to anything that Bush has done. It's really not very clear that many of these bilateral or multilateral relations of the United States in Asia are any better after Bush than they were at the end of the Clinton administration. So it's very difficult to argue, as many of the Bush people do, that this is a consequence of specific actions by Bush. And I think the more fundamental question, and the one that I want to address in a little bit more detail, is the question of whether the path to the present was really marked by the creation of a number of avoidable problems and bad consequences that were the result of the Bush administration's policy. In effect, Fareed Zakaria makes the interesting point that some of you may have seen in Newsweek, I think a week or 2 weeks ago, that Bush has been on a learning curve, that the Bush administration is beginning to do some things right, including, for example, improving the relations with the six-party talks with North Korea, or improving its relations with China, et cetera, et cetera. But from my standpoint, the White House is an awfully expensive place through which to go through a learning curve, and it may be important to recognize that an awful lot of mistakes were made along the way, even if in the last year or so some turns in the positive direction have been made. I want to argue three things with you that are beyond the specifics of individual relations between the United States and country X, Y, or Z. I want to stress the fact that Bush's reliance on military tools has worked against the general trends in Asia and has been a negative. Secondly, that Bush's economic mismanagement in the United States has led to a diminished American influence in Asia. And third, that the Bush administration's focus on unilateralism and its unwillingness to engage regional institutions flies in the face of a move in exactly the opposite direction within Asia as a whole. So these are the three broad points I want to make, and I'll try to go through them with you in some detail. But in order to do that, I want to say a few things, particularly because I'm in an Asian environment, about the domestic base of the Bush administration. I think it's important to recognize, and certainly my understanding of some of the failings in Asia trace back to the particular electoral support base from which Bush managed, or the Republican Party with Bush managed to become president and from which they rule. The first of these, there are three main elements in this coalition. The first is what you might think of as security hawks, or those favorable to a strong military and industrial institution and a strong military presence around the world. The Democrats, by way of contrast, generally much weaker links in that regard. Very strong anti-tax groups, the Coalition for Growth, lots of anti-tax libertarians, those who are opposed to big government, Democrats generally more in favor of larger taxation, larger government. And finally, an important group that's reflected, in fact, in Sarah Palin's choice by John McCain, that is to say, so-called values voters, fundamentalist Christians, Christian conservatives, those who are taking a very strong position against abortion, against gay marriage, against a whole host of social issues on which they feel very strongly and on which they vote very strongly. America is an interesting place politically in terms of the whole notion of checks and balances and the notion that various institutions will balance each other out. We are not structured, as some countries are, for top-down tight leadership, but rather our process of governance can be very complicated. But the Bush administration really worked to try and override many of these so-called checks and balances. For much of its time, it had a Republican Congress and a pro-Republican Supreme Court. Many of the Bush policies were not challenged either in Congress or in the courts. And of particular importance, to me, is this fact that Karl Rove, the electoral master behind the Bush administration, has operated to try to create what you might think of as a permanent Republican majority. That is to say, to use government policies as a way to reinforce and strengthen the electoral base of the Republican Party in the hopes, as he saw it, that the Republicans after Bush would have something akin to what the Republicans had after the McKinley administration in 1898, namely a roughly uninterrupted period of 40 years or so of conservative Republican rule. And in keeping with this, the Republicans pursued what Scott McClellan, formerly press secretary under the administration, called a permanent campaign. That is to say, instead of governing with an eye toward what the best policies are for governance, the concern was inevitably what are the best governance policies in order to ensure the continued Republican majority. So all issues were essentially politicized to maximize electoral benefits. At the risk of not paying as close attention to my time as I should, I'll share one anecdote with you on this. A good friend of mine was president of a company based in, I'll just leave it as an Asian country. He was identified in 2004 in a New York Times article as someone who was supporting John Kerry for president in an article that was written about Democrats and Republicans who were abroad but who were supporting various Republican or Democratic candidates back in the U.S. And he made some comments to the effect that he was really working very hard from his base in Asia to ensure Kerry victory. 3 days later, his boss in the United States, the CEO of the main company, received a copy of the New York Times article, underlined with my friend's comments underlined, and in the parentheses, the comments in the margin said, what has the Democratic Party done for your company, named, lately? You better get this guy under control. Signed, Karl Rove. My friend got a phone call very quickly telling him that he'd better keep his mouth shut and behave if the company was going to keep him on board. So there was this permanent politicization of an awful lot of what went on in the United States. And of course, as I'm sure everyone here knows, an awful lot of American foreign policy was driven by the so-called neocons and a strong realist perspective globally. I won't go through the mistakes that were made in Iraq. Suffice only to say that ideology tended to take greater precedence over military and strategic planning. There were an awful lot of comments made before the invasion of Iraq that we would be greeted by the people in the street with flowers and roses, and that the Iraqis had no internal religious conflicts that would lead to difficulty, et cetera, and it's taken roughly 6 years before the United States has begun to even begin to gain some merit of military control in the area.
Take a seat.